Snow-capped rocky crags, reaching into the skies, trees that are ever verdant, blanket the slopes to the rocky edges of timberline, icy streams that tumble their way down, cutting deep into the earth on their way to the seas, rails on ties that are spaced just 3 feet apart, condensed steam escaping from yet another Baldwin steam locomotive. While these scenes may evoke the views of some of our familiar haunts in the American Southwest, we are anywhere but. Where we normally find the rails near timberline in our own backyard reaching 2 miles above the lapping waves of the oceans. Today, we'll never even escape something we're not used to. Thick, heavy air that never exceeds an elevation of 3,000 feet above sea level, and the solar winds dancing across the inky skies above us in colorful rivulets. No, today we find ourselves in the last frontier, the wild hinterlands of the Yukon and Alaska. Today our rails were not cast upon this land by the track layers of the Rio Grande in 1880, but by those daring souls in the winters of 1898 and 99, by the railroad companies of the Pacific and Arctic Railway and Navigation Company, the British Columbia Yukon Railway, and finally the British Yukon Railway. Of course, to know them by all three would be a bit much. So then, as now, they were collectively operated under the banner of the now famed White Pass and Yukon Route. From 1898 until its shutdown in 1982, the original incarnation of the White Pass and Yukon hauled the riches, goods, and travelers of the Yukon. The railroad and its ocean-faring subsidiary pioneered the use of containerized shipping years before the standard shipping container took over the globe. Even now, with this ubiquitous innovation, the White Pass's original incarnation took 2 blows in the last quarter of the 20th century that it could not survive. The first was the completion of the Klondike Highway in 1978. 2-lane blacktop connecting the line's termini was the death knell of the line's manifest freight and vehicle ferry service. The final curtain would fall when its supply of high-profit, transloaded containerized ore from the Anvil mine ceased flowing in a global metals recession in 1982, stopping the wheels turning for the first time in 84 years. All that was left was the die-hard tourist market, which would prove to be the railroad's salvation and redemption. While the railroad had always been cozy with the tourism market, in such that the Canadian Pacific itself had its steamships docking for 2-day journeys on the line until the 1950s. The modern cruise ship day market began to drop passengers en masse literally on the railroad's front doorstep. Well, in this case, forward dock. And so the line resumed operation in 1988. New life breathed into it as an exclusive tourist hauler. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, the modern White Pass rehabbed and built upon itself. Over the next decades, the modern White Pass began reacquiring, reactivating, and rebuilding its diesel fleet. Gone was the drab bankruptcy blue of its final days as a common carrier, and in was the resurrection of their as-built green and yellow schemes of the 1950s and 60s. New passenger cars were pressed into service to augment the ancient wooden fleet and to weed out the later but smaller steel coaches that lacked the soul and panache of their predecessors and suffered from lower capacity. In 2019, what seemed like Frankenstein's monster took to the rails, looking of a mismatch of a modern wide-cab diesel and the innards of an SD40 run by a modern control stand. These 30 series were built by National Railway Equipment of Mount Vernon, Illinois, based off an export diesel for the Australian market. These new locomotives displaced many of the line's historic fleet of diesels, though today one can find these historic Alco diesels plying the narrow rails of the Durango and Silverton, and another configuration with the same prime mover, 114, built by Bombardier, now plies the high desert rails of the Cumbres and Toltec. But the star of our show today is Locomotive 73, and it is smaller than what we're normally accustomed to. The last of 4 built by Baldwin over a span of 8 years in 1947, Her tractive effort is only 25,200 pounds, which is 2,300 pounds of effort shy of the K-28s from the Rio Grande that once pounded the rails here during World War II, of which the last three still remain plying the rails of the Durango and Silverton today. The 73 also has many other differences than the large locomotives of the Grand, including wheels that are exposed, as 73 is a traditional inside frame steam locomotive, lacking the counterweights to connect the rods to its wheels. Among other differences include the front end throttle, a power reverse, oil cellar boxes hidden on the axles inside the frame, roller bearing trucks on the tender, and its gauges illuminated by LED lighting. Started in 2018, the latest rebuild of the 73 was completed in Arlington, Washington, and barged back to Skaguay. An additional work was performed by FMW Solutions later on, including a modern 26 schedule brake stand in the cab, improvements to the running gear, and oil crank pins. With the ever-growing trains of the line, the 73 is not used on the massive trains for the general cruise ship masses, but instead normally utilized on its own excursion between Skaguay and Bennett, 40 miles each way. Those mechanical improvements keep the steam locomotive operating as fast as possible in the mix of what is basically a commuter railroad schedule operating on a mountain grade. Today, we're hopping on a train behind it pulled by either vintage 90 class diesels, originally built by General Electric and engined by Alco, or one of the newly built 3000s. This allowed extra water to be pulled along without creating the redundancy of a second cistern behind the locomotive, and to utilize the dynamic braking of the diesels, a process where the train is slowed using the traction motors of the diesel, creating electricity to be dissipated through massive resistors, keeping our train in check on the 3 and 4% grades. While the sun is beginning to brighten the Lynn Canal, the fjord that provides Skagway's only access to the sea, we find ourselves at the Skagway Depot, where we find 73 with its train ready to take us up the hill. We'll be covering the entirety of the modern White Pass and Yukon, from Skagway through British Columbia to Carcross, Yukon, where we'll take the journey in the order of a round trip between the two on a Pete Lerro-led photographer's charter. Since we departed the coach yards, we're running on a well-ballasted, 2 main track line with welded rail. Quite a change from the single track, sinking into the weeds, jointed rail line that stereotypically many would think of when seeing a tourist railroad. For our first location out of Skagway, we'll stop at Bridge 2A, where the 73 will pace and race a pair of the line's iconic 90 class diesels on the glass-like line from here to Boulder at milepost 5, where the lines converge back to 1. These classic diesels, while keeping their iconic appearance, sport modern innards, powered by a Cummins power plant and updated controls for the engineer. Arriving at Denver, we find the 73 crossing the modified trestle here over the East Fork of the Skaguay River, which is fed by the vanishing glaciers far up the valley. Of course, it wouldn't be a Pete Lerro charter without performing a night shoot, and we see the 73 steaming across the river at a clip far below the 15-mile-an-hour track speed to allow photographers to freeze the locomotive over the river under the near darkness of the early evening. Our next location takes us to Clifton, the first location and shortest siding on the entire line, where two trains can pass after leaving the two main tracks between Skagway and Boulder. Here, the siding is perched on the vertical rock walls above the Skagway River and can be a very busy place in the summer with regular meets involving 3 or 4 trains within 10 minutes. Climbing ever further up the walls of the canyon above Glacier, at milepost 15, we find ourselves clinging to the sides of Tunnel Mountain, where 73 rounds the razor's edge and skirts the retaining wall that replaced the original trestle here. Shortly after, though, the 73 will cross the impressive remaining wooden trestle and enter the 250-foot bore that cuts through the backbone of this cliff face. During the stampede of the Yukon in the late 1890s, many a hopeful gold seeker attempted this route from the Tidewater to Lake Bennett over White Pass, only to be stymied by the Northwest Mounted Police at the border, preventing their entry into Canada until they procured at least 1,100 pounds of food and other supplies. With the amount of provisions and their desperation to get to Dawson, many a prospector drove their mount into the gulch below to the Eternal Gates, giving this rocky defile the name of Dead Horse Gulch. Originally surmounted on the railroad by a switchback into the narrow chasm, it was quickly spanned by the railroad's cantilever bridge. So much an icon of the line, nearly every herald of the line has featured it, from the early days of steam to the diesel locomotives that replaced them. Today, this one-time tallest cantilever bridge in the world stands creaking over the abyss, long shorn of the tracks where heavier trains necessitated the current traverse of the gulch and its tunnel to be constructed when the heavier ore trains of the later years began their roll to the sea. Today, we watch as 73 steams out of the ether through the tunnel along this relatively new piece of railroad here at Gulch. Back on the original right-of-way, we watch as the 73 blasts its way up the canyon of Dead Horse Gulch, the final assault to the top of White Pass, while the twin Dewey Peaks and the Sawtooth Range stand in the background, already showing their white coats for the long winter ahead. Surmounting White Pass, we crest the boundary range of the Coast Mountains, the spine of rock that runs along the Alaska Panhandle, at an elevation of 2,888 feet above sea level, and enter the Great White North itself, the Dominion of Canada. From here, we'll glide along the headwaters that feed the Great Yukon River, starting here at Summit Lake, all the way to the end of Lake Bennett at Carcross. Along the journey, we'll cross through the border checkpoint at Fraser and skirt other early vestiges of the Yukon River, too numerous to count. At Bennett, we arrive at the quaint depot that is the largest remaining building to stand in this remote ghost town. With the arrival of the railroad, the Stampeders no longer dwelled here to construct boats for their journey down the Yukon, and many buildings were simply floated away to other locales. Today, not much remains save for the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church and the depot, which was used as an eating house for hungry passengers, and in later years of common carrier operations, a place where American and Canadian crews would swap trains and return to their point of origin. For the next 25 odd miles to Carcross, we'll be rolling along the shores of Lake Bennett, where we perform numerous run-bys along this placid stretch of water nestled in the glacial Carver Valley. at Scheffler Siding, named as an honor in 2014 for longtime White Pass foreman Willie Scheffler. We take the hole here to allow a work train led by two of the remaining 101s to overtake us. These two classic diesels, built by the Montreal Locomotive Works, were built specifically for this railroad with the ore boom of 1969 and its increased traffic. Both the 110 and the trailing 109 have been on this railroad since then, and are an integral part of the fleet to this day. Pennington is a remote section house located along the shores of the lake. During the days before mechanized track work, section gangs in charge of the track would live in this remote dwelling to perform work on their assigned portions of the line. Today, the building awaits its eventual fate when it will succumb to the elements. We soon find ourselves skirting the edge of the Yukon Territory as we arrive at Carcross, portmanteau of Caribou Crossing. This remote outpost is as far into the line's namesake as we can roll today, as the remaining portion of the line is still in a moorbound state. We find ourselves on the first passenger-carrying train to take to the rails of the new turning loop on the outskirts of the village to head south towards Skagway. Even as we turn back towards Alaska, we'll stop here for now and continue onward in our next installment. I'm Big Deal, and I'd like to thank you for coming along on this steam-powered journey to the Yukon.
You're here. It's the end of the video. You made it. And since you're here, you can watch one of these other videos. And if you haven't, make sure you click like and subscribe so you get more content like this in your feed. I'd like to thank you for watching. I'm Big Deal.